Hi folks, I just want to talk to you today about Rockbox. Rockbox is an open source jukebox firmware, and I'm particularly interested in this because I'm an iPod owner. Now, I really like my iPod, but there are a few things about it that drive me really crazy. So the option to use a firmware on it, and if you're not familiar with what firmware is, it's kind of the inherent software that makes any electronic device run. The idea behind looking at Rockbox is that it will address some of the issues that I don't like about the iPod. Now, it's not just the iPod that it works with a variety of MP3 players, and if you go on the Rockbox website, www.rockbox.org, you will find a list of supported MP3 players. Now, the later iPods unfortunately aren't supported, but the earlier iPods are. I've got a 4th generation iPod, and that, as you can see, iPod 1G through to 5.5G, is indeed supported by Rockbox. So for me, this is something I really want to look at. But first, just want to talk about the kind of issues I've got with the iPod and why I feel Rockbox will solve these for me. Now, first of all, I just hate the fact that to get music on your iPod, you've got to sync it up through iTunes. Now, iTunes is a great piece of software. It's great for organising your MP3s and your music, etc. And it's a great way of ripping music to MP3 as well. So I like it from that point of view. But what I don't like is the fact that you have to use that to get the music onto your iPod. You can't drag and drop like you can with other MP3 players. And indeed, I also don't like the fact that iTunes is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I've only got a 4th generation iPod. I don't need all the video stuff and the TV stuff. You know, in actual fact, I can use a very early version of iTunes, to be honest. What I want to be able to do is to drag and drop. Because another thing I want to be able to do is to use it with different computers. I don't want to be tied to one computer, and iTunes unfortunately ties you to that, or iTunes and the iPod, because the iPod has to sync up to one library and it can't sync up to another library. So if you've got stuff on your work computer and you've got stuff on your home computer, you just cannot use it to kind of transfer music between the two. So that's reason number 2. Reason number 3 is once the music is on there, it doesn't use the file names that you've given it. It kind of encrypts them, uses these 4-digit codes. So even though you can enable disk use on your iPod, you can't actually identify the music files you've got on there. So you can't even circumvent the kind of iPod iTunes system just by dragging and dropping the files by enabling disk use, because as I say, you just cannot identify them. So for me, Rockbox can solve all of those problems. I can still use iTunes if I wish, but I don't have to. But I can drag and drop. I can use it on different computers, and you know, it for me sounds like a great idea. But also, Rockbox reckons that it sounds better, and I will vouch for that and say I agree. I'm amazed that just a firmware change can make it sound better. You kind of think it's ultimately the same hardware, but somehow the Rockbox firmware seems to work better in that respect. I didn't have to play about with any EQ settings or anything, just straight out of the box, Rockbox just sounded better. It's clearer, it's a wider sound, there was a better bass which was more defined. Just love the sound of Rockbox. And if that's not a good enough reason to change, well, I don't know what is. Well, the next question would be, well, okay, Rockbox sounds good. How do I get it on my iPod? And if I put it on my iPod, what happens if I don't like it and I want to change back? Well, the good thing about Rockbox is it does not overwrite what is already on your iPod. It doesn't even overwrite any songs you've got there already. Okay, Rockbox can still find those and still play them. Though if you want the full functionality, it probably is best to take the songs off and put them back on again, so that Rockbox will store them with those correct file names, but you don't have to. The thing is, Rockbox installs a couple of things on your iPod. It installs the firmware itself and a bootloader. What the bootloader does, when you switch your iPod on, it tells the iPod to boot to the Rockbox firmware, not the Apple firmware. Okay, now there is a little tweak you can do to even still make it boot into the Apple firmware if you so wish, but I'm not going to cover that in this video. It also means that it's very easy to take it off if you don't like it. You just delete the firmware and delete the bootloader, and you are done. And Rockbox contains all the instructions and all the tools you need to make that happen. So first of all, let's cover what you need to do to install Rockbox on your iPod. The first thing to do is to go to the Downloads menu and click on Releases. Okay, and this brings up the Rockbox 3.6 download, unless of course you're viewing this after a new release, in which case it'll give you a different release number. It gives you two options. You can either use the automatic install method, or you can use the manual install method. The automatic install method just requires you to download the installer. You then run the installer, connect up your iPod. Please make sure that you've enabled disk use on your iPod, and you can do that in iTunes by checking the right box. Then you tell the installer where your iPod is on your computer, so it will just be the appropriate drive letter. On this computer here it's J, but it may well be E, F, G, H, could be anything. And you need to tell it also which model of iPod you have got. You can run an auto detect on it, so it may be able to find it, but that's the 2 bits of information that it will need. You can then just tell it to do a complete install, and it will install everything you need to do with Rockbox on your iPod, the firmware and the bootloader. You can also, within the automatic install method, select components that you wish to use, kind of a custom install if you like. The alternative method is to use a manual install. What that requires you to do is to download two things. First of all, the appropriate firmware for your computer, and as you can see, it's got all the different MP3 models listed that it supports, and the ability to download the firmware and the manual. So download the firmware, but also download the manual as well, because the manual has a link in there to something called the iPod catcher, which is the other bit that you will need. The iPod catcher will manually install the bootloader onto your iPod. So the firmware is installed onto your iPod by basically unzipping it straight into the root folder of your iPod. It's actually a hidden folder. It's .rockbox. So if you enable view hidden files and folders in Windows, you will actually be able to see that. Okay, and then once you've put the firmware on, run the iPod catcher, and it will then come up with like a command line menu, and it will ask you to select what you want to do. You just click on I for install, which you will then do. It only takes a few seconds to do it. Then press enter, and you are up and running. If you want to uninstall it, then the manual method is dead easy, because you just run the iPod catcher again. This time select the uninstall option to uninstall the bootloader, and then just delete the .rockbox folder from your iPod, and that gets rid of the firmware as well. And it really is as simple as that. And I would certainly recommend you give it a go if you want to try doing something a little bit different with your iPod. On top of that, you also get some fantastic array of games that you can play on your iPod as well. There's a lot more extras in there than you get with the standard iPod. So there we go. I hope that's been a kind of a helpful and informative video, and I would suggest you check out the Rockbox website. There are some forums on there, and a wiki. Plenty of helpful information from people that are trying this using Rockbox. With it being open source, it's continually updated and improved, and of course, most importantly, it's all free. So thank you very much for watching.